I'm going to talk about the subject dearest, I believe, to Mr. Jefferson's heart, which is liberty, and in particular, liberty and religion. America's religiosity is nothing new. For a long time, perhaps since we began, many more Americans, a much higher percentage of Americans, have believed in such articles of faith as the afterlife and the virgin birth than any European country has, or indeed any other mature democracy. Historians have disagreed to some degree about what the explanation of this is. One view that now enjoys a certain popularity is that paradoxically, religion has thrived in our public life because of the First Amendment. That is, because we have no established church. An established church, as in Britain, tends to suck in fringe sects. When there is no established church, these tend to thrive and become more militant. What's new in our politics now is not, I think, the religiosity as a phenomenon, but the power, militancy, and apparent success of evangelical religious movements in our politics. Religious leaders claim that President Bush's victory in 2004 was down to his frank endorsement of a religious basis for his thought and action. We don't know whether that's true. Most of that argument is based on an exit poll strategy in which many Americans said that what they called moral values were decisive in their deciding how to vote. But we don't know precisely what moral values means, and many people think that Bush's then very strong stance against terrorists played a larger part than his religiosity. We don't know, but one thing that is fairly evident is that political leaders all across the spectrum, who anyway are always fighting the last war, seem to be rushing to church in very great numbers. There was an article in the New York Times a month or so ago reporting on the speech of the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives. The headline was, "Isaiah was a Democrat." And that, I think, is going to be the shape of the argument for a while. Of course, the enthusiasm for bringing religion into politics and public life is not unanimous. It's not unanimous even among religious leaders. Former Senator John Danforth, for example, who is a minister, who was Bush's ambassador to the United Nations, recently wrote that he thinks that a sectarian movement has taken over his party, the Republican Party. He said, "When I was a senator, I worried every day about the budget and about poverty. I spent no time thinking about gay marriage." But he said, now it seems to be the other way around. There is a great deal of controversy and some bitterness about the question, new bitterness about the question of what role religion should play in our public life. What there is not much of is argument. I mean, genuine argument in which people attempt to find principles that can be very widely shared, and then to argue their position from principles that it would be reasonable for them to expect those to whom they talk also to accept. That's political argument. We don't have much of that in this country now. We need more. I'm going to try and construct an argument of that character in hopes of engaging you in the kind of argument that, in my view, we lack. Now, how should we proceed? We could talk about the issues that are now prominent on the interface between politics and religion. And there are many of these. Chief among them, of course, is abortion. I think abortion played the dominant role in transforming the evangelical movement, which, as I said, has always been an important social force in the United States, into a political force. It gave right-wing Christians in particular a cause which they thought galvanized them and justified their entering into politics in ways they hadn't before. Abortion brings with it many other issues, stem cell research, which I don't believe would have been an issue but for the abortion controversy. But there are many other issues as well. In 2004, the abortion controversy was joined by the controversy I mentioned about gay marriage. And there are plenty of other controversies. Our president justifies national policy by appeal to God's will. Our religious leaders, some of them, call for opposition to candidates whose views they think are against the teachings of the church. We divide about whether, for example, our Pledge of Allegiance should contain a reference to God. We disagree about whether the coins we carry in our pockets should have "In God We Trust" stamped on them. We disagree about whether government should distribute education vouchers in the confident knowledge that most people who use those vouchers will use them to select parochial schools. We argue about whether a judge is entitled to put a stone tablet in his courtroom with the 10 Commandments engraved on it. We argue about whether Darwin and the Big Bang theory of creation should be taught in our public schools to the captive audience of children. And if so, whether those children should also be told that in addition to the received Darwinian as cosmological explanations, there are other scientific theories that challenge these and that claim an intelligent designer. We disagree about all those things and more. We disagree, for example, about whether people whose religion requires certain behavior should be exempt from general laws prohibiting that behavior. We disagree, for example, whether conscientious objection should be limited to those who believe, as a matter of religious faith, that they should not kill, and not extended to people who hold the same view, though they are atheists, on moral grounds. We disagree, famous Supreme Court case, about whether Indians, a tribe of Indians who use peyote, a hallucinogenic drug, in their religious practices, should be exempt from state laws outlawing such drugs. We could talk about these issues and hosts of others, but we know that the list I just gave you is not only incomplete, but will soon be out of date. The cutting-edge issues about the separation of church and state change all the time. It would be very difficult for us to attempt to decide what those cutting-edge issues will be in a decade or so. So I propose a different strategy for discussing this issue. I'm going to distinguish two rather abstract models of how we should think about the relation of church and state in the American polity. And I'm going to attempt to argue in favor of one of these models and against the other, but drawing from principles that I hope we all can accept, or almost all can accept. Both of these models accept something which we are blessed in the fact that so many Americans do accept, which is the idea of religious tolerance. No one of any importance, no church with any traction in the United States, disagrees with the proposition that people should not be coerced into adopting any faith, should not be coerced into religion if they are atheists. We are a tolerant, in that sense, society. But from what base should this tolerance spring? And here is the distinction I offer you between two models. The tolerant religious model supposes that the United States should be, as a nation, committed to religion as a personal and public value, except that that commitment should never justify imposing religion or any particular faith on anyone. That's the heart of what I will call the tolerant religious model. The tolerant secular model supposes differently that as a nation we should not be committed to any view about the value, importance, truth of religion, even in an abstract way as a commitment to monotheistic religion. The tolerant secular state argues that we should, as a nation, in our political life, be indifferent about religion, though, of course, in a spirit of tolerance, we should accept the fact that religion is important to some people and in no way impede the practice of religion. Which should we be? A religious nation that tolerates dissent, a secular nation that tolerates religion. We have examples of both choices. Israel is a tolerant religious state. It is committed to a particular religion. It is a Jewish state. In principle, however, it accepts freedom of religious practice. France is a paradigm example of a tolerant secular state. France, with its Jacobin history, could be nothing else. When Jacques Chirac flew to the funeral of the late Pope, he was very widely criticized for doing so and had to say he did it in his personal capacity. England is a more complicated, or I should say Britain, is a more complicated case. I believe, having lived there part of the year for a very long time, that it should be counted as a tolerant secular state. It does have an established church of which the Queen is the head, but I think that's more a matter of the British love tradition and ceremony. If any British Prime Minister were to say, as our President says constantly, that God supports his efforts on controversial matters, that would be the end of that politician's career in Britain. You might say we shouldn't be committed to either of these models. We should combine the best of each. As a practical matter, I can understand that suggestion. And that, in fact, I believe, is true of us now. I think understanding our political structure in practice, we'd have to say that we draw elements from each. But I also think that compromise is incoherent, and that when we discuss this issue, attempting to do so in the spirit not of practical politics, but of principle, we have to accept that these state two very different principles of political organization and that in the end we have to choose between them. Not that we will choose between them, but to the degree that we don't, we're not behaving in a principled way. But how shall we choose? One strategy has marked, let's say, mainstream liberal political philosophy in the decades since John Rawls became our most prominent political philosopher. And that is the strategy that Rawls called the strategy of political liberalism. We should invite people to think about politics prescinding from bracketing their personal, ethical, and religious commitments. We should accept that religion is parked outside the voting booth, that we argue together about politics appealing only to ideals that we can share. That, of course, is a very attractive idea. We understand its genesis, its history, in the horrible religious wars. But it's also an unrealistic idea, and in my view, not quite legitimate either. We can't ask people to set aside their most profound convictions about the truth of deep moral and ethical issues when we are also asking them to make decisions, including decisions about how to vote, that are for most people the most basic and fundamental moral and ethical decisions they will in their lifetime be called upon to make. We can't ask people of deep religious conviction to forget that conviction in politics, because for them there is no difference between politics and religion. Politics for them is part of religion. So how shall we decide? I think we need to pursue a different strategy. It's the strategy I promised when I said I want to start an argument of a certain sort. I think we should go back and try to find principles, very basic philosophical principles, if you will, that unite us, and then try to excavate those principles to see what the best interpretation of them is and how they bear on this issue. I'll say in a moment what I think the most pertinent philosophical principle is, but I want first to go back to the two models I distinguished and try and identify the differences between them more precisely. I'll use a distinction much beloved of constitutional lawyers in this university as in every other, and that is the distinction between the two parts of the First Amendment that treat of religion. First Amendment forbids the establishment of religion and forbids infringement of the free exercise thereof. And as I said, constitutional lawyers emphasize the difference between those two injunctions and indeed often suggest that they conflict with one another. I'll take them in any case in turn. When it comes to the Establishment Clause, what I've been calling the tolerant religious model interprets the ban against establishment to mean a ban against establishing any particular sect, making Methodism or Catholicism or Judaism or Islam the official religion of America. It does not, according to this model, include forbidding the state to endorse religion, let's say monotheistic religion, to take a stand on its value and importance. So a tolerant religious model would encourage our leaders to appeal to God, as President Bush does, as I said, repeatedly. Bush defends his policies abroad by saying that in pursuing liberty, he is bowing to the will of the author of liberty. He doesn't mean John Stuart Mill. The tolerant religious model would not raise an eyebrow about the Pledge of Allegiance containing the reference to one nation under God. It would endorse cities and towns creating and maintaining Christmas creches, Christmas trees, menorahs, and other public ceremonial religious paraphernalia. It would provide no objection to that. The tolerant secular model, of course, takes an entirely different view of establishment. It understands the ban on establishment to be a ban on the endorsement of religion, no matter how abstractly defined. The state must be neutral about religion. It would forbid a pledge of allegiance that contains a reference to God. It would forbid using money collected coercively in taxes for displays of religion that match the religion only of some citizens and fly in the face of the conviction of others that religion is a lie. The difference between the two models can, it seems to me, be captured if we think of the seminally divisive issue of school prayer now. On the tolerant religious model, there is absolutely no reason why there should not be prayer in the public schools. Of course, the prayer must be ecumenical. The Lord's Prayer that I myself recited every day in school would do just fine. There would be no reason to hesitate to impose an ecumenical prayer of that kind, except one, and that is, except for the fear, to which, as I said, the tolerant religious model is just as sensitive as any other, the fear of intimidation and coercion of children whose parents do not want them to join in prayer or who do not want themselves to join in prayer. It may very well be that allowing those children to remain silent will solve well enough the problem of intimidation, but perhaps not. As many liberals argued in the 50s and 60s, perhaps not. Perhaps the intimidation will remain because children will not want to isolate themselves from others in that way, in which case that would be an argument against prayers, even if they allowed for exceptions. On that psychological issue turns the question of whether the tolerant religious model can support public school prayer. But of course, for the tolerant secular society, that psychological question is absolutely irrelevant. It doesn't matter who's intimidated and who is not intimidated. It is wrong in principle for an instrument of the state to endorse in that way religion as against non-religion, to facilitate and therefore to participate in a religious practice. Now, let's think of the other arm of the First Amendment, the prohibition on any infringement of the free exercise of religion. I've already said that both of the two models endorse freedom of religion. They're both tolerant, and you may think that there's therefore no difference to be drawn when we think about free exercise. But that is not the case, because the two models differ about the foundation of the right of religious freedom. For the tolerant religious model, religion is something of importance, of capital importance in itself. And it therefore makes perfect sense to someone drawn to that model to say religion is sui generis. We can, for that reason, have a right of religious freedom without recognizing any broader right of freedom. The tolerant secular model cannot say that. It cannot distinguish a right to religious freedom from a more general right to freedom by saying that religion is of particular importance because the ontological force of the secular model is to dispute exactly that. Now, that model must draw its particular right to religious liberty from a more abstract and general right, a right, let's say, to freedom of conscience of some more general kind. Now, that difference figures immediately in the scope of the freedom that religion generates. For the tolerant religious model, as I said, the right of exercise of religion in the orthodox way is protected. But what is not protected is the right to freedom of conscience in other matters that also touch people's personality in the same way that religion does. So on the religious model, there is no reason to suppose that the right to religious freedom includes a right to abortion, or a right to practice homosexuality, or a right to gay marriage, or anything else, because these are not rights to religious practice. It may be that the reasons that a religious model would offer for prohibition of abortion, for penalty on homosexuality, for a ban on gay marriage, it might well be that the reason given for banning these activities is a religious reason. But there's no inconsistency in saying our reason for stopping this is religious. But your right to the free exercise of religion has nothing to do with it, but because these are not religious activities. But the tolerant secular model can draw no such distinction. Once it has recognized a general right from which the specific right to religious freedom is drawn, then it needs to take on a substantive argument as to how far that more general right extends. And that's the question which I think we must now focus on. I said a while ago that I would try and find some principle we share which would allow us to center on that issue. The principle I suggest is this: each of us has, every human being any place has, a personal, inalienable responsibility to decide for ourselves what success in living consists in, what would be a good or appropriate life for us. Each of us has that inalienable personal responsibility. Now, of course, that is not a personal responsibility recognized everywhere. Quite the contrary. You read recently, was it in Afghanistan, of someone sentenced to death because he wished to abandon his Islamic faith, convert to Christianity. That is something which is condemned by the principle of personal responsibility. And no religion, as I said, with any traction in this country, would oppose that principle. We all think, don't we, that Jefferson was right when he said, and this is the first part, often not studied as much as the second part, of his famous sentence that ends, building a wall of separation between church and state. The sentence begins, believing that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, and that he owes account to none others for his faith or his worship. And then the sentence continues. And that's what we believe. Now, what does this right encompass? What does this responsibility, I should say, encompass? It does not, of course, we have to be very plain about this. Your personal responsibility does not mean that you are immune from the impact of the culture in which we all live. That is impossible. The culture shapes your ideas and your children's ideas about what counts as a good life. It is, as parents know, it is particularly difficult in this country now to resist the force of the sovereign idea that material success is an indispensable ingredient in a successful life, that wealth counts. Not all of us accept that, but we have to accept the impact of the media and of the culture more generally. We can't be immune from that. But what we can claim to be immune from is subordination, ethical subordination. And by that I mean that we can claim to be immune from the deliberate coercive imposition on us of an idea dictated by others about what a successful life, a good life consists in. We must be immune from subordination in that respect. That means that we must together construct an American conception of liberty which honors that personal responsibility. There have been different ideas about what liberty is across the centuries, strikingly different from one another. But if we're to create an ideal of liberty that matches the sense of personal responsibility for our own values that I think we all share, then we need an account of liberty that makes that personal responsibility explicit and protects it. And that seems to me to require a certain set of distinctions. I'm going to try and construct too briefly, too crudely, an account of liberty to show what would be necessary in order to respect the personal responsibility I just mentioned. And we need some vocabulary. So I will use the word freedom in the following way. Government compromises or infringes your freedom whenever it prevents you from doing something that you want to do, or indeed might want to do. So understood, freedom is not a political value at all. It's a mere descriptive term. It's not a political value because when the state stops me from stealing or murdering or kidnapping, it certainly constrains my freedom, but it does nothing wrong. We have to construct a political value by constructing an account of when government does do wrong, when it compromises my freedom. Liberty is the power to do what the government has no right to stop us from doing. and what the government has a right to stop us from doing, in part depends on how we understand the personal responsibility I just described. I believe, and I hope you agree with me, that we have no right freely to use property that is not rightfully ours. We have no right to impose injury freely on other people or on their property. That means that liberty is not constrained. Freedom is, but liberty is not constrained when the government has an adequate distributive reason for limiting freedom. By that I mean when its reason is a plausible, sound theory about what the rightful ownership of resource and person is. So, it seems obvious, doesn't it? Laws against theft and kidnapping do not constrain liberty, though they do constrain freedom. Taxes, assuming they are fairly based, do not constrain liberty, though of course they constrain freedom. So let's say, in constructing our account of liberty, that when government has a plausible, distributive reason, a reason that has to do with a judgment about the correct assignment of rights to things, then it does not invade liberty. Now, distinguish that kind of justification from what I'm going to call a personally judgmental justification. A personally judgmental justification purports to justify constraints on freedom on the idea that government knows better than individuals the right way to live. Paternalistic laws are a very clear example. If the government prohibits the distribution of pornography, for example, on the ground that pornography is bad for the people who consume it, that it makes their lives despicable and wasted, then that argument is a personally judgmental argument. I emphasize this clumsy phrase, personally judgmental, because we must be careful to distinguish that kind of justification from another kind of judgmental justification. When the government limits my freedom in order to protect the environment or in order to protect some national treasure like a great forest, or in order to stop me from building a Victorian monstrosity on my own property in a Georgian square, then what the government does may or may not be justified, but it's not appealing to a personally judgmental standard. It's appealing to an impersonally judgmental standard, a standard about what's excellent and what should be preserved, but one which does not presuppose any account of what is in itself a good way for people to live. Now, the principle of personal responsibility that I described is one that condemns personally judgmental justifications for constraining freedom. And that is, it seems to me, a part of any account of liberty which people who recognize and accept the personal responsibility I described must also accept. You might say, I've gone too fast, because you might think that the argument is over. If I'm right, then a state cannot impose religion even in the way in which, let's say, a public display of a creche would impose religion. But the argument doesn't have that quick a conclusion, because the argument that people who support a tolerant religious view of society doesn't depend upon paternalism. It depends upon something much more robust, which is the right, the claimed right of a majority to create the kind of environment it wishes, not for the sake of those who resist it, but because they want to live in and bring their children up in a culture that is congenial. That, after all, is the argument used by people who oppose pornography, the distribution of sexually explicit literature. In the old days, in the famous Lady Chatterley's lover trial, the famous publisher Basil Blackwell, whose store many of you will have gone into, testified for the prosecution. He said, "I hereby swear under oath that I read Lady Chatterley's lover and I was corrupted." Poor man. And as you know, the checkered history of the litigation that followed. Nobody makes that argument anymore. Nobody says, "Oh, I think not. Pornography should be banned because it corrupts people who read it. It's bad for them." They say, we don't want to live and to raise our children in the kind of society, the kind of culture shaped by the free availability of this kind of literature. It makes it impossible to bring our children to understand the importance of intimacy structured by love. And of course, various women's movements make a parallel argument. They don't argue that they're wanting to save the souls of the pornographers. They argue that a culture in which women are in public displays treated as sexual slaves or sexual addicts is not one in which women should be required to live. This is the principle, that a majority is entitled to create the kind of culture that it wishes to live in and raise its children in. This is the kind of argument that is, in the end, the strongest argument, not just for banning pornography, but more generally for what I've been calling the tolerant religious model. Newt Gingrich has said this, sorry to appeal to a famous political philosopher, but Newt Gingrich has said repeatedly, we are a Christian country. 94, I sometimes get this mixed up with ivory soap, but I think it's 94.6% of us believe in God, and we are entitled to create a culture that sustains that belief. That's the argument. And it requires us to confront an issue about which political philosophy has had surprisingly little to say, but which finally we come to in this argument. And that is the issue of how a culture is properly formed. We start with this fact. I have been speaking rather glibly of our culture, the culture in which we live. But of course, we live in several cultures. There's an economic culture. There's a moral culture. There is what I want to call an ethical culture. It's the culture I mentioned that says living well means being rich, or living well means having the right attitude towards sex, or living well means having the right attitude towards God. That's the ethical culture. There's, of course, also the aesthetic culture. That's the culture that teaches us that putting ugly buildings in the midst of Georgian squares is a bad idea. We lead our lives in the sea created by these various currents of our culture. And we have to ask the question, how should we arrange this culture, these various distinct cultures to be created? And cultures are created in many ways, but I now want to distinguish the two most important ways. Culture is created organically as a vector of individual decisions. Decisions people make, free to make them, every day, one by one. Our economic culture is largely organically formed. It's formed by the decisions you and I make about what to buy, what to produce, what to put our money in if we have any surplus to invest. It is through what we call a free market in such transactions that the macroeconomic culture, which means the supply and demand of different products at particular prices, including the price of labor, gets fixed. The second way in which a culture gets formed is through a collective imposition on the culture. And to some degree, our economic culture is also framed that way. The decisions of the Federal Reserve Bank, for example, are not organic, they're collective. And so we confront the question, what is the right balance between these two with respect to the separate and distinct cultures I described? The conservative tradition in our country emphasizes the importance of the organic method of forming the economic culture. Socialism, they condemn, and I believe rightly, as a violation of freedom as well as an inefficient method of running an economy, because the economic culture, and as I say, I mean supply and demand and prices, should in a free society be fixed organically. Now, I hasten to tell you that I think the results of the free market should be redistributed in an egalitarian direction, but that's not the subject of today's talk. What I want to emphasize is that the conservatives who insist that the economic culture should be created largely, if not entirely, organically, want the ethical culture to be created collectively and not organically. And the same liberty is at stake, but more dramatically in the ethical case, in the two strands of culture. If our personal responsibility means anything, then it requires us to adopt a theory of liberty such that our ethical culture is formed organically as a vector of individual free decisions. Why do I emphasize that distinctly for the ethical culture? Because that's what personal responsibility is about. We don't have personal responsibility for following our own rules in distribution and morality. We have to accept collective rules about that. Our responsibility, and the Supreme Court recognized this, I think, wonderfully in its Casey decision, our responsibility is an ethical responsibility. We have a sovereign duty shared by every religious tradition with any force in our culture, as well as by other philosophical traditions. We have a responsibility to decide ourselves what counts as value for our lives. We can't stop being influenced by culture. But we must resist the idea that that culture can itself be shaped by a majoritarian imposition of one view for everyone, because that's subordination, and that's inconsistent with this responsibility. So I do come in the end to a conclusion with that extra step. It isn't a liberty against paternalism that requires us to accept the tolerant, secular model for our society. No, it's a concern for our personal responsibility, for the dignity and the self-respect that that responsibility flows from and solidifies, that we have to think about when we choose between these two models. And what I hope to engage in that argument is people who agree with me that the personal responsibility I describe is real and as fundamental as I take it to be, but think that I've drawn the wrong conclusion from it, who will now argue when we turn to the question period, who will now argue with me that starting from that personal responsibility, we have adequate reason to choose what I call the tolerant religious rather than the tolerant secular society. I've got, I think, about 3 minutes left of what I engaged myself to speak for, and until I'm reprieved, I will try and observe that limit. But I did want to say something. I've written about some of the particular issues I mentioned a while ago in these remarks. I've written a book about abortion, and if anybody wishes to engage that issue in the question period, I think that would be very profitable. But I want to say a thing now distinctly about the gay marriage issue. That did become of surprising and unknown importance in the last presidential election. I don't know of any politician who talked about gay marriage who actually read Chief Justice Marshall's opinion in the Massachusetts Supreme Court. No doubt all of you have, but you're rather special. The case of gay marriage seems to me to be a wonderful locus for concentrating on the remarks I made and the impact of these about culture. Marriage is a remarkable and unique and ancient institution. It provides a form of commitment between two people that cannot be achieved in any other way. We can no more invent a substitute for marriage than for poetry or love. To deny that value to two people, two adults, who wish to enjoy that kind of commitment to one another would require an extraordinarily powerful justification. I believe the only justification for doing that, for denying that opportunity, is this. Marriage is, as I just said, unique and very valuable, and its value and importance and meaning have accreted over many centuries. And over all those centuries, central to its meaning and understanding is that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. And that if we allow that to change, then we will lose some of the meaning, some of the importance, some of the value of the institution. That seems to me to capture what, when you set aside the homophobia and the other disreputable tendencies, that seems to me the argument that must be in the field and that must be answered. But I think I've provided the grounds for answering it, because that argument depends on the assumption that a majority has the right to sculpt and shape the meaning of a cultural institution as it wishes. The meaning of cultural institutions develops organically. The meaning of religion itself has developed organically over centuries. When you think of the changes in the social meaning of religion that have been brought about by political movements, like the movement to permit women priests in the Episcopalian religion, for example, or that have been brought about by theological movements like Unitarianism or transcendentalism or mysticism. The meaning of religion has changed, and no one supposes that the meaning should be protected by the steel of the law from further change. But that's what is proposed about the meaning of marriage, that it be frozen in the shape a majority now wants it frozen. And that, as I've said, is a violation of the recognition of the fundamental personal responsibility we all have. The ethical culture belongs to everyone and therefore belongs to no one. That seems to me the trajectory launched over 2 centuries ago by Mr. Jefferson, and since we're dedicated today particularly to respecting that trajectory, we can do no better than by saying, as I believe he would say, we must be a tolerant society, but a tolerant secular society. Thank you.